Well, thank you, Peter Singer, for coming along to talk to us today about your research. And what we'd really like to know about is the history, where you started, because I think it was in the early 1970s where you first started thinking about animals and animals in society.
Yeah, that's right. I was a graduate student at Oxford University, and I had never really particularly thought about animals as an important subject of ethics up to that time, and very, very few people did. And I was attending some classes taught by Jonathan Glover. They were about free will and responsibility. And I remember asking a question in the seminar, and there was some discussion. And at the end of it, when it finished, a Canadian student, Richard Keshen, came up to me and asked me something about what I'd asked or about the response. And we got into a discussion about the subject of the class. And as it was lunchtime, he said, "Would you like to continue the discussion over lunch?" So I went with him to his college. He was at Balliol College. And for lunch, the college offered a hot dish, which was spaghetti with a kind of brown sauce on the top, or a salad plate, a cold salad plate. And Richard said, asked, "So can you tell me if there's meat in that spaghetti sauce?" And when he was told there was meat in it, he took the salad, and I took the spaghetti. And so we continued the conversation, and when we dealt with that topic, I said to him, "So, you know, what's your problem with meat? Why did you ask that question?" And he said something like, "I don't really think it's right the way we treat animals in order to turn them into food," or something along those lines, which surprised me a bit, because firstly you have to realize that at that time it was very rare to meet anyone who was a vegetarian. If you did meet a vegetarian, chances were he or she was of Indian origin, and was a vegetarian for Hindu religious kind of reasons, cultural reasons. There were a few people perhaps who were vegetarians because they thought it was better for their health. But the idea that you simply thought that the animals were badly treated and that there was something wrong with turning them into meat was not really something that you ever came across. And so we got into more of a discussion about it. And he said, "Well, if you're interested, come and talk to a couple of other Canadian graduate students, friends of his, who actually had started him thinking about this issue." And they were Stanley and Rosalind Godlovich. Stanley was doing a degree at Oxford, and Rosalind, his wife, had come with him. So I got to know them quite well. And as it turned out, they were compiling an anthology. It turned out to be this anthology, in fact, Animals, Men and Morals. It was already more or less, I think, the work was more or less done by the time I got to know them. So we talked quite a bit about this, and I started to think about it myself, and I read a little bit more in the area of what other people had written, which was very little really in terms of contemporary people. You could find things in Aristotle or Kant or something like that about why we were justified in using animals the way we were, but very little contemporary stuff. So I got interested in that and decided that really they were right, and that I couldn't justify continuing to eat meat, so I joined them, becoming a vegetarian. And then this book came out, but it was, I guess they were hoping, and I was by then hoping, that it would have some reaction, that would start a debate about whether we're justified in treating animals the way we do and rethinking their ethical position. But it got really no attention at all when it was published in Britain. There was not a single significant review. There was, like, I think the Observer had a paragraph, 5 lines, briefly noting the existence of the book. But there was nothing. It just really sank like a stone, sadly. And then a year or two later, well, I should say in the meantime, we'd started trying to do things in a practical way. We'd organised a demonstration in the main shopping street of Oxford in Cornmarket to try to basically just tell people about the way their food was produced, because very few people knew anything about factory farming then, although it was already in existence. So we became a bit active. But the next step, at least for me, was when Rosalind and Stan told me that this book was going to be published in the US, and with a fairly small publisher, Taplinger, but still. And I thought, well, is there something I could do that would try to ensure that it didn't sink without a trace as it had in Britain? So the leading publication for discussing radical ideas at that time was the New York Review of Books. It was something that pretty much everybody read. Its coverage of the Vietnam War, its coverage of issues about race, black liberation movement, so on, women's liberation movement. Yeah, that was the place to read. So I thought, well, you know, in a way this is another liberation movement. And perhaps you know, I could write a review of this book for the US publication of it, which would help to attract some more attention. So I wrote that essay, or actually I wrote to the editor of the New York Review of Books and got a reply saying, well, could be interested, let's see the piece and I'll let you know. So that was enough encouragement. So I wrote the kind of review essay which took off from this book and then presented the germ of my own later animal liberation position. Fortunately that was published, the editor liked it, it came out in 1973. And I think, you know, that was for me the start of writing about this, and it led to the further development of the writing of animal liberation, because there were suggestions in the mail that I got after that this would be a topic for a book. So that's really where I got started.
And it seems to me from what you're saying is that you took a very practical ethics stance, because you said you should become vegetarian as well as writing a book about it rather than a theoretical.
Well, I didn't think one could really, you know, if I was going to make my career ethics, and I didn't think that I could really think that it was ethically unjustifiable to eat meat while I was, you know, doing it twice a day or whatever, right? I mean, I don't think that's, if you're doing that, but essentially you're saying ethics really doesn't matter, because even though I think that this is wrong, I'm not doing anything about it. And it's not as if, you know, it's such a life-changing thing. It's not as if I was going to starve to death or be malnourished or unhealthy. I mean, I was well aware that there are people who live very healthily, and so yeah, I think that was something that was really incumbent on me to do, to take it seriously as a matter of practical life, not just as a purely theoretical argument.
And so did that encourage you to become involved in campaigns, other campaigns, because you talked about demonstrations on the streets in Oxford?
Well, I mean, I had been demonstrating in other campaigns before, even before I came to Oxford at the University of Melbourne. I was, I think, president for a time of something called Melbourne University Campaign Against Conscription. So Australia was involved in the Vietnam War, and the Australian government had restarted conscription. There was no, prior to that, there had been a period when there was no military service required in Australia, and the government restarted it, and conscripts were starting to be sent to Vietnam. So I was part of that group that was in opposition to the Vietnam War and in opposition to conscription in particular, and we certainly had, you know, there were large demonstrations against the war in Vietnam, of course, in Melbourne before I left. I mean, I was participating in those. So that was not new to me, but, you know, given that you then find a new cause, something that seems wrong, well, trying to organise some sort of demonstration seems the obvious thing to do. I mean, this was tiny, you know, there was me and Richard and his wife Mary and Stan and Roz and maybe John Harris and 2 or 3 others who were attending that. It was just a handful of us, with a bit of help from Compassion in World Farming, which is now a major international organisation, but then was just really this one guy, Peter Roberts, who we got in touch with, and he provided us with some wire battery cages, the kind that hens are kept in, and a couple of paper mache model hens, so that people could see how crowded the hens would be in such a cage. And we also had a veal calf made out of felt stuffed, which was in a kind of crate or stall the size of in which wheel cars were being kept. So really, it was really, you know, in a way, it was a matter of public education as much as a demonstration.
So what was the reaction to your book?
The first reaction to the book was that it got some very nice reviews and quite a lot of attention. It got a full-page review in the New York Times Book Review, which was very positive, so that was really exciting. It got a lot of other coverage in other newspapers around the country. And I did a bit of publicity when it came out, and I got on major television things like the major morning breakfast show, which was run by Barbara Walters, who was a very big name in US television, and a number of other things. So it got quite a lot of attention. It wasn't a huge bestseller. It sold respectably, but the interesting thing about the sales is that they just kept going. And actually, over the next 5 years, the animal movement built up, and then the sales started to build up. So when the animal movement was building, organisations like People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals were founded. They started attracting, you know, first tens of thousands and then hundreds of thousands of members, and then those members started getting the book. So the book, in the end, sold well, but it didn't sell well, as most bestsellers do, in its first year or so, and then they kind of disappear. It's a book which has been selling ever since, and you know, it's still in print. This is the current edition, so since 1975 it's never been out of print in English.
So do you think it's changed lives?
I'm sure it's well, it's changed a lot of humans' lives, because lots of people write to me or come up after I've given a talk and say animal liberation made me a vegetarian. I've even had people saying animal liberation made my mum a vegetarian, and that's why I'm a vegetarian, because I was brought up one. So it's certainly done that. And obviously it's contributed to the animal movement, which has changed the lives of hundreds of millions of animals. So it's had some effect there, but it's very hard to sort out when you're talking about a large movement with lots of people involved. It's very hard to sort out, you know, the contribution that one book has made.
So the work that you've done since then has concentrated on animals, but other areas as well. But thinking about the work that you've done on animals, how would you say is it continued with that work? Has it changed at all?
It's not changed an enormous amount, and one of the reasons why I've, you know, philosophically done a lot of other things is that I still think that the philosophical foundations that I sketched out in Animal Liberation are correct. I've not seen anything that's really refuted them, in my view, you know, in their basic outlines. And I didn't just want to repeat myself. So, you know, there are certainly things that one can go into in more detail and discuss more, and I've done a little bit of that. But otherwise, I've been doing things like, well, I've edited a couple of books about animals. First, Animal Rights and Human Obligations, a collection with Tom Regan. Then In Defense of Animals, which was a collection that brought together philosophy writings and activists. And that then had a sort of second edition called In Defense of Animals, The Second Wave, which brought that up to date a few years back. Then together with Jim Mason, we did a book about food, this one, The Ethics of What We Eat, which sort of considered a range of different issues about food, not just the animal issue, also issues about the environment in particular, the environmental impact of what choices about what we eat, fair trade issues, global poverty issues. So that also relates to it. But yeah, I don't think I've really changed a great deal in terms of the basic views that I hold from the time I wrote Animal Liberation.
So tell us again, what are the basic views in that original book?
So the key idea is that if we look at the way we treat animals and the way we think about animals, it is akin to the way in which, for example, white people have thought about Africans in the worst days of racism, and particularly the days of the slave trade. That just as they had a prejudice or bias against people who were African or not members of their own race, and therefore thought themselves entitled to use them as means to our ends, to enslave them, send them to Africa, send them to America, get them to work on plantations, you know, really just treat them as things. That's still the case with animals. That is, it's still the case, obviously, that we treat them as things. We treat them as things to turn into food, or as to experiment on, or to get fur from. And we have this attitude, this kind of prejudice to taking seriously their interests. We discount their interests. We think that they don't really count when it comes to a clash between our own interests. And not only with our own interests in survival, but even our own interests in enjoying our meal, because really that's basically what it is when people say, you know, I like to eat meat, at least in a developed society like ours. It's not that I can't nourish myself without meat. It's overwhelmingly, well, I just enjoy the taste of it. So my argument was that if we got rid of speciesism, which is the term that I use to make the point that there's an analogy with racism and sexism. If we get rid of this bias against beings who are not members of our species, then we would have to say, well, they have interests, and where their interests are similar to ours, we should not give less weight to their interests than we do to our interests. Because if we don't discriminate against animals because they're not human, then if they're feeling pain, and if the pain is just as bad as our pain, how can we justify giving it less weight? So the principle that I come out with is the principle of equal consideration of interests, that we should give the same consideration to the interests of different beings, and where these interests are similarly strong, if you like, similarly significant, where the amounts of pain or pleasure at stake are similar, then we should give the same weight to it. So that's really the basis. It's the principle of equal consideration of interests, which is a non-speciesist fundamental principle of ethics.
So thinking about speciesism and trying to challenge speciesism, who is an animal in your definition?
I mean, the animals that matter are those that are capable of feeling pain or pleasure. In other words, sentient beings. I would use the term sentient to mean that they have some consciousness or some awareness. So, so you know, there may be animals that don't feel pain. I mean, maybe oysters don't feel pain. That seems reasonably plausible to me. Not certain about it, but it's plausible. So they're still animals, as it's a zoological term, but they're not beings to whom you can give equal consideration, because if they can't feel pain, then they just don't have interests. If they can't feel pain or pleasure, they don't have interests. So you can say, well, I'll give them equal consideration, but since there are no interests, equal consideration of zero interest still means zero. Effectively, they don't count. So, so the animals are those beings where it's reasonable to believe that they may be capable of conscious experiences, feeling pain or pleasure. Which is certainly, I think, all vertebrates. Some invertebrates, clearly, like octopus, I think you can't really explain the behavior of an octopus without assuming consciousness. Others where we're less sure about it, crustaceans, I would say, yeah, you don't need to eat them, so why not give them the benefit of doubt? But insects sometimes are more of a problem, because it's very hard to live sometimes without killing insects, getting rid of insects. So I think that's justifiable, because it's hard to know whether they do feel pain. If you don't need to do anything that would cause them suffering, of course you shouldn't. But yeah, that becomes a grey area when you get to that point.
The analysis of who is sentient changes, the definition changes. So at one time octopus wasn't considered to be a creature who feels pain, and now is considered to be. And fish weren't at one time, and now they are. So we see the line moving. So there might be a number of animals who are considered to be. Yeah,
I mean, I don't think I think the whole thing is just a spectrum. I don't think there's any kind of sharp line. I think there's beings where there's overwhelmingly strong evidence that they are conscious beings, and also we can know quite a lot about their conscious states, because they're either human or beings rather like humans, you know, great apes and so on. Then there's ones where we can still be highly confident that there are conscious experiences, but we know a little bit less about them. Some of them have not even been very studied. You know, you mentioned, and then there's others where, yeah, they're invertebrates, so we were doubtful. But now as we do more study with the octopus, it becomes more plausible to think that they are capable of feeling pain. And you mentioned fish. You know, yeah, I think again, we've got more evidence now than we had before, and it's highly probable that they can feel pain. I wouldn't say it's completely certain, but highly probable. So I think we have to keep an open mind and give these beings the benefit of the doubt where we can.
And when you're talking about pain, is it something that you're locating within physical pain, or is it something that's...
I think pain is a mental state. There needs to be consciousness. We understand quite a lot about the physical sensations that occur, but pain itself, that cause pain, but pain itself is not the physical, you know, it's not the firing of the nerve, because the nerve could fire without there being consciousness. So pain can't be the firing of the nerve itself. It's rather the mental state that nerve firing causes or leads to.
So what you've moved into, I think, more, not necessarily more recently, but since the 1970s, is thinking about the human and the animal, and the relation between the human and the animal in other ways. Would you say that, because you've written about the human as well as the animal?
I've written a lot about humans, but actually, you know, I haven't written about, well, I haven't written much about the human-animal relationship as such, and particularly not since Animal Liberation. I mean, in Animal Liberation I had some discussion of the history of the human-animal relation and some other aspects of it. But I think the common thread in my work has been that I've looked for places where perhaps changing our ethical beliefs will lead to changes in the world which make life better for significant numbers of beings. And obviously, you know, reducing suffering is a really important way of making life better. Not the only way, but a really important one. So I've looked for cases where changing the way we think ethically could reduce suffering. And, you know, right from the start, in fact, even before my initial New York Review of Books essay on animal liberation was published, I'd written an article about the obligations of the rich to people in danger of starving, to the global poor, an article called Famine, Affluence and Morality that appeared in 1972 in Philosophy and Public Affairs. So, you know, there was more or less a simultaneous thing, I suppose, that I started thinking about the ethics of how we ought to treat animals, and I started thinking about the ethics of what we owe to the global poor. And I wrote about them. By and large, I would say I've written about them as separate issues. There are clearly connections, and in this book, as I said, I talk a bit about the impact of what we eat on global food prices, which affects the poor, because we feed so much grain and soybeans and fish meal to animals. It's a vast waste of food that you know, helps to keep food prices high. Similarly, of course, what we eat relates to climate change, because livestock are such a big producer of greenhouse gases, and climate change is going to fall most heavily on the global poor. So there are clearly connections, but I would say that I've run those arguments somewhat separately. The third major area that I've worked on, I guess, is bioethics. And there's a bit of a connection in that there are life and death issues in bioethics. Questions about whether abortion is justified, questions about euthanasia, including both voluntary euthanasia and euthanasia for severely disabled infants. So that relates to questions about the wrongness of killing. And I think the idea that somehow the lives of human beings are sacrosanct, whereas the lives of animals are, you know, worth very little, is another speciesist idea. So there's a connection there, and that once you reject speciesism, you do start to think about questions about what makes killing wrong in very different terms, because you no longer say, oh, it's because they're human or the members of the species Homo sapien that it would be wrong to kill them. That argument isn't going to work anymore.
So those views are considered to be controversial by some.
They are, you're right, yes.
So what sort of reaction have you had to those views?
The views about euthanasia and sanctity of human life? Yeah, that's been in a way. I mean, obviously when animal liberation came out, that was controversial, and a lot of farmers were outraged by the suggestion that we should stop eating meat and that this was wrong. So that was controversial in its own way. But it was what I wrote about euthanasia, and especially about euthanasia for severely disabled newborns, became controversial. The curious thing is, it wasn't controversial when I first wrote it. This book, Practical Ethics, of which this is the third edition, came out first in 1979, and it contained my views about euthanasia for severely disabled infants. In fact, I would say now it contained them in a somewhat cruder version than I hold or that I've put forward in this book. So that came out in 1979, and there were no protests then. In fact, the first really heated protests about that came fully 10 years later, and not in Australia where I was living when I published Practical Ethics, nor in the United States where I went occasionally to give talks, but in Germany where I was invited to speak at a congress organised by Lebenshilfe, which is a German group of the parents of children with disabilities. And they had actually invited me. They wanted to have a sort of debate with me about my views. But more radical disability advocates thought that I should not even be allowed to speak. So they basically campaigned for my invitation to be withdrawn, and they were successful in that. Lebenshilfe yielded to the pressure and did withdraw the invitation. That in fact then turned out not to be enough for them, and they insisted on the whole Congress being cancelled, or which it was. And then for the next few years, it was very difficult for me to speak anywhere in German-speaking countries, in Germany, Austria, or the German part of Switzerland. I had protests that sometimes turned violent. Certainly, you know, they were prepared to use physical force to block the entrances to the lecture theatres in which I was going to speak, or they came in equipped with whistles and made a lot of noise, so I was drowned out. In one case, somebody jumped on the stage and took my glasses and stamped on them on the floor, so smashed my glasses, and I'm fairly short-sighted, so can't do very well without them. So that was probably about from 89 to sometime in the 90s, maybe, and that's what caused the most amount of protests.
So do you mind my asking what sort of effect that had on you personally?
Most of these people had never read anything or any books that I'd written. What they'd seen, somebody had given them a leaflet which had a few sentences taken out of context, and they had a completely false conception of my views and where I came from. And it was frustrating, especially if they're not prepared to listen to you, they don't want you to speak, or they drown you out when you get the occasion to speak. You can't really have any way of enlightening them about what I was really trying to say. So that was very frustrating. Eventually, you know, there were some people, some groups that were prepared to sit down with me, and did get some discussion. And so slowly, I think the atmosphere changed, and it got somewhat better.
There were people within the animal studies, critical animal studies areas, who have criticised your work for other reasons. Yeah. For perhaps taking what they might perceive to be a welfarist approach rather than trying to change things in the way in which they would consider that we should.
Yeah, sure. Oh, look, that doesn't really trouble me. As I say, it troubled me that if people deny you the freedom to express your views and to get into a discussion, I think that's a very negative thing. And I think, that's, although these people somehow, thought that they were defending the rights of humans, they were really, I think, going down a path that the fascists went down in terms of preventing speech. But within the animal movement, obviously it's you know, people can have a range of different views, and the views that you're referring to are not really about the fundamentals of the philosophy of animal liberation, but they're about tactics. What are the best tactics to use in order to end speciesism? So I think that ending speciesism is a very radical change, and that the only way to get to a place like that is by incremental steps. So I don't think we should wait and say, you know, the only thing we want to do is to make everybody vegan, because that's going to take decades. In fact, obviously it's already taken, it hasn't happened, so it's already more than 40 years since my first article on this topic was published. It hasn't happened. So if we can make progress by reducing the suffering of billions of hens in cages around the world, or hundreds of millions of pigs and veal calves and other animals, I think we should do that. There are people who think that you shouldn't compromise at all, that you should just say, you know, vegan or nothing. Obviously they've got a right to argue for that position, and I don't think that they've actually made much headway in the movement. I think the majority of the movement accepts the idea that we ought to be campaigning for reforms that fall short of what we really want.
Could there be an issue, and I think this is one of the issues that's referred to, is that if reforms take place, then that's the goal, is the reform? No,
I don't think that's a goal. I don't think, I mean, it's certainly not my goal. It's not the goal. Say, you know, I had this great friend and wonderful campaigner in the animal movement, Henry Spira, who I think was probably the single most effective campaigner for animals in the last quarter of the 20th century. And he always said, you know, the goal is animal liberation, but you need steps on the march. You need to get there. It never became the goal for him to just say, you know, let's stop the testing of cosmetics on animals, which is one of his achievements. That was never the goal. Once he'd done that, he moved on to another campaign, you know, then started focusing more on animals used in factory farming. He knew what the goal was, and I know clearly what the goal is, but you know, we can only get there, it seems, step by step. I just don't see that we're getting there any other way.
So thinking about some of the other issues that have been raised about your work, and your work has been very influential, as you've intimated, because there are lots of people who have read your book, and there are lots of people who have said that they've become vegetarian and vegan, and become involved in animal rights. But others have criticised you because I think there have been a couple of places where you said that in the last there are situations where you would, for example, condone experiments on animals.
Well, look, I'm a utilitarian. I've been a utilitarian before I've been an animal liberationist, and you know, that's something that seems to me to be the soundest ethical position. So clearly, if you're a utilitarian, and if, let's just take a hypothetical case, if someone says, well, suppose that we could cure a disease that kills millions of people, or perhaps that kills millions of animals, by doing something that will kill a few dozen or 100 animals, or maybe also inflict some pain or distress on them, but will, you know, alleviate the pain and distress of millions of humans or millions of animals, then a utilitarian is going to say, well, if that's really the only way you can do this enormous amount of good, if you've looked at everything else, there's no other way that you can do it. If you're giving full weight to the interests of animals, as you would give if they were humans, you don't discount them just because they're animals, then that's going to be justified. No utilitarian could really, I think, reject that if you consider it as a hypothetical case. Now, it's another question whether in the real world in which we live there are such experiments. That is, it's another question whether any experiments on a small number of animals can be confidently predicted to be not only a way of finding a cure for a major disease, but the only way of finding a cure, or the most effective way, best way of getting there for finding a cure for a major disease? That's a very complicated factual question, and there's lots of argument can go on both sides. I don't hold myself up as an expert on that particular question. But all I'm saying is, if there are such cases, if it becomes clear on the facts that there are such cases, then to say that those experiments are ethically justified is not to be a speciesist, because you are giving full weight to the interests of animals. And, you know, I guess the utilitarian will have to say, if the only way to cure this disease were to do the experiments on a small number of humans, that would also be justified. I think this is again the point that once you reject speciesism, the traditional idea of not only the sanctity of human life, but the sanctity of human rights, in a way, changes, because you don't draw such sharp distinctions between humans and animals. Now, you can draw distinctions where there are humans who have capacities, mental capacities, that are clearly not capacities that any non-human animal has, at least any non-human animal in our world. Maybe there's some elsewhere on other planets. Then you can start saying, well, it's not speciesist to say that this being may suffer more because of their capacities than that one. But of course, there are humans who have capacities that are not superior to non-human animals. There are, that's why I talked about sort of profoundly intellectually disabled humans don't have cognitive capacity superior to those of chimpanzees, or perhaps not even of dogs or pigs. So you can't say that they have rights which those animals don't have. You have to put them on the same footing.
So thinking about the changes that there have been, because one of the things you mentioned earlier was that there was factory farming when you wrote
it already existed in the 1970s,
not in the way it does now. And there have been many changes, many technological changes in the past 40 years. What sorts of effects do you think they've had on animals and the way in which we treat animals? Do you think there's been positive or negative?
The negative clearly is that factory farming has grown enormously since the 1970s. The number of animals existing in factory farms, the number of animals suffering in factory farms is vastly greater than it was before. And that is, to a significant extent, because of the fact that in Asia, in China particularly, but also in India and Taiwan and Korea and Malaysia and Singapore, people are more prosperous, or let's say there's a large middle class that never used to exist before, and they are consuming more meat. And so there are vastly more factory farms in the world. And that's a terrible thing for animals and for the environment, and probably bad for the health of the people who are eating more meat as well. But so that's the negative, that's still with us in developed nations and increasing in nations that were once poorer. But there are some positives, and particularly, in the European Union, the laws that have been passed to improve the conditions of battery hens, to improve the conditions of pigs, to improve the conditions of veal calves, have been significant and have affected, it must now be in the billions of animals who've suffered less because of those laws. So that's definitely progress, and I think we should continue to push for more of that kind of progress and hope that it spreads. That it's already spread a bit to other countries, to the United States or parts of the United States, like California, for example, which has a law that also would change the conditions of factory farm animals, that's being phased in and will come into effect on the 1st of January 2015 if the various lawsuits against it are not successful. So I think, yeah, there has been progress, undoubtedly.
What about the effects of genetic modification and those sorts of changes, and in bioethics and the use of genetically modified animals, and the way in which we now, or not we, but the way in which humans consider those animals to be their property because they have been...
I don't think, as far as animals are concerned, genetic modification has had a lot of impact. We are not, I'm pretty sure I'm right in saying we're not eating any genetically modified animals at this stage. There are animals that are eating genetically modified grains and soybeans, as we are ourselves directly. But in any case, you know, in terms of people say, well, it turns animals into things. Look, animals have been things for thousands of years, unfortunately. I don't think it really changes that in a significant way.
In biomedicine, animals who are genetically modified are
Yes,
considered to be property. I mean, they're all considered to be property. I appreciate what you're saying, because they've been created or they've been changed in some way. So they are models that can be used, and there's no problem there. And there are many. Really,
yeah, sure, that's true. But for me, the question is simply, are they suffering? Well, probably like most experimental animals, they're suffering. But are they suffering more because of the genetic modifications? Well, certainly some of them have, because the genetic modifications have not worked. You know, they've tried doing things like putting human growth hormone into, or the gene for human growth hormone into pigs so that they would grow faster. And the pigs sort of end up getting arthritis and dying in painful conditions. So I think that's clearly wrong. You know, putting a gene into a animal so that there's some secretion in its milk, probably doesn't make any difference to the well-being of the animal. I don't know. I mean, you would have to look at each individual case. But if it doesn't, again, I don't really see this as a separate, significantly important, separate ethical issue, apart from the fact that we have been for a long time treating animals as if they're interested and can't. We have bred chickens for people to eat who grow so fast that they can be killed at the age of 42 days, 6 weeks, and often their legs are too immature to support the weight that they grow to in those 6 weeks. So they just collapse on the floor in the giant sheds where they're being reared in tens of thousands. The unfortunate birds, some of them, just collapse on the floor. They can no longer walk. They starve to death or die of thirst because they can't reach the food and the water. You know, that's horrendous. And that's not a result of genetic engineering. That's just a result of breeding for faster growth. And as I say, that's just the continuation of what has been done for thousands of years. People have bred from cows that produce more milk, or from hens who lay more eggs, or from pigs who produce more bacon. I think that's all part of that phenomenon. Once, you know, we have the ability to genetically modify humans, then parents are going to want to do it to give their children an edge, or perhaps initially to prevent some disease that perhaps they're genetic carriers of. So I don't think this is going to be a kind of, for very long, a big barrier between humans and animals, that we genetically modify animals and we don't genetically modify humans.
So have you got any views about what the future might be?
I think we're continuing to make slow progress. I had hoped when Animal Liberation was published we'd make progress much quicker than we have. So in that sense that's disappointing, but it would have been vastly more disappointing if we'd been making no progress at all. I think the fact that we're making progress gives one hope that we'll move faster. I mean, and you know, I've already mentioned the changes of laws that have happened, but just in these last few days that I've been in Austria, what you notice is that there is, excuse me, just these last few days that I've been in Austria, what you notice is that there are now demand for vegan products. So you see a lot of restaurants, I mean there are specifically vegan restaurants, but there are a lot of restaurants which indicate that their food is vegetarian and vegan. There are stores that, you know, I just walked into a supermarket around the corner, a standard sort of mass market supermarket, and it has labelled various kinds of vegan spreads to put on bread. Now, you know, when Animal Liberation was published, nobody knew what the word vegan meant. I mean, even in England, which was kind of where the idea, there was a vegan society that was founded in the 40s, when Animal Liberation was published, I think it had 350 members, and that was probably all the vegans in Britain. In fact, probably it was pretty much all the vegans in Europe, right? So now there's, I've been told, there are 80,000 vegans in Austria alone. In a nation of 8 million, there's 80,000 vegans. you know, that's 1% of the population. And the word is known, that people see it in the supermarket everywhere. That's a huge change. So I think that's encouraging, and I hope that if we go forward another 10 years, then we have like 200,000 vegans in Austria and equivalent numbers in other developed countries. And that spreads, that, you know, in a way, once you develop a critical mass, more people can see that, oh yeah, this is not so crazy. This is quite a good way to eat, a good way to live. Doesn't mean that you don't have lots of enjoyable, tasty food. So why not?
The focus of lots of what you've written and what you speak about is food. What about other elements of being vegan?
Well, look, okay, other elements of being vegan?
Yeah, like shoes.
Like you mean shoes and things? Yeah, I'm wearing vegan shoes too. But, you know, I mean, it's really food production that is the cause of this vast universe of animal suffering that is created. That's really the core of it. So, you know, some people say, well, why don't you talk about animal experimentation more? I mean, for one thing, as I just said, it's more complicated. But look at it this way. If you take the United States as an example, we don't have exact numbers, but the number of animals used in experiments in the United States is probably, you know, could be estimated to be around 25 million. You know, that's a lot of animals, 25 million. It's about the population of the state of Texas. The number of animals killed for food each year in the United States, virtually all of whom have been through factory farms, is around 10 billion. So that's more than the population of the entire world. So you compare one state of the United States with the population of the entire world, rather more than, almost 1.5 times the present population. You know, that gives you the scale of what we're talking about with the food industry, and that's why I focus on the food industry, because you know, there we're talking globally, perhaps we're talking about 60 billion land animals at least, and not to talk about, you know, fish, which might run into 1 trillion. So the numbers are vast, and that's why that's the most important area to change, I believe.
Do you think that people's concerns about their health is having a positive effect?
The sort of health-based reduction of animal products, I think, is leading people to say, well, you know, I won't eat so much meat, maybe I won't eat any meat at all one day a week. So there's this movement in America called Meatless Mondays, which is catching on. And that's having a significant impact. I mean, as I said before, global meat production is increasing because of the influence of China and India and other nations. But meat consumption in the US is actually falling now. Just in the last 4 or 5 years, it's started to fall, and it's a pretty clear trend. So this is really interesting. This has never happened before. In US, meat consumption has gone steadily up. Beef production has fallen a bit, but then it was replaced by chicken, which people said, well, it's not as unhealthy as eating red meat. But now the total is falling. And so I think that there are a lot of people who just say, well, for my health, for the environment, and perhaps because of some concern about animals, I'm going to not eat as much meat.
So what do you think of the moves towards trying to make in vitro meat?
I think in vitro meat would be a great thing if it could be economically produced in an environmentally sustainable way, because it would mean that people who somehow insist on the real thing would be getting the real thing. It would be actually meat at the cellular level. So yeah, I support the development, production of it. I don't know whether it's going to be successful or how long it's going to be. I think we also have lots of other meat-like foods that are being produced, and you know, I think these plant-based meat-like foods may turn out to be easier to produce in an economically competitive way with meat, and in a way that's environmentally sustainable. And if so, that'll be fine too.
So do you see any ethical issues associated with in vitro meat, or is it just...
No, because you're not, I don't see it as having any ethical problems, because it's not involving any sentient beings. I mean, there was once a sentient being from whom the original cells were taken, but you know, when you produce, if you can produce the meat in a factory or whatever, there's never a sentient being involved.
Thinking about the project that you're involved in at the moment, which I think is the Great Ape Project, do you want to tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, well, the Great Ape Project is actually not something new. It's something that Paolo Cavalieri, an Italian animal liberationist, and I developed in the early 1990s when we edited a collection of essays that was really like a manifesto of rights for great apes. So let me make it clear, you know, I'm not saying that we should have rights for great apes but not for other animals. The idea for both Paolo and myself was that the great apes would be a kind of a bridgehead, because we can empathize with them, we can understand their emotions by looking at them, understand their behavior. They are obviously genetically quite closely related to us, and big advantage, at least in the developed countries, we don't eat them, so there's no large industry based on consuming them. That it would be possible to get people to recognize rights, basic rights like the rights to life, liberty and protection from torture for a non-human animal. And that was our goal, and that would then reduce the gulf where we have, you know, humans on this side and animals over here. We wanted to say, no, there's a spectrum. The great apes are very closely related to us, very similar to us in many respects. Other animals are similar to them, and so on. And this has made some progress. It's led to some changes in the law. For example, in New Zealand, it became illegal to experiment on great apes except for their own benefit, not just for human benefit. In Britain, regulations about the use of great apes in research were changed so that no great ape experiments are being done there. And in fact, effectively across the entire European Union, there are no experiments being done on great apes anymore. There used to be, Austria actually had one of the last laboratories. Austria and the Netherlands had the last two. And they've gone now, and that's a very good thing. In the United States too, where there was the largest number of chimpanzees were being experimented on, that's almost completely stopped. You could say it's virtually completely stopped. There was some being held in case of some, you know, pandemic emergency that could only be tested on them, but basically that stopped. And in Germany now, and Austria too, there's a revival of the great ape project, which had lapsed for a little bit in terms of looking at great apes in zoos that are being used for entertainment in zoos, often in horrible conditions, and there's a movement there to regain their, or re-establish their rights there. So it is making some progress. Again, I would have liked to see more and more rapid progress. But it's good that we're starting to recognise, I think, that there are some ways in which we used to treat even the great apes, which are now ethically unacceptable.
Well, thank you very much, Peter Singer.
Thank you. Oh, it was very good to be here in Vienna, and yeah, I enjoyed meeting with other philosophers as well. And I hope, as you suggested, maybe in a couple